Hello and welcome to Headlock History, the series where we explore the story of British professional wrestling, its rise, its fall, and its potential comeback. In this episode, I'm delighted to say that I was joined by the team behind Wrestling Heritage, a long-running project and archive dedicated to preserving the forgotten history of British wrestling. We dive here into the golden era of the sport. This is a forgotten history for many, and is crucial to understand in order to know the history and evolution of British wrestling up until today. A lot of what we go over today won't necessarily be new for those who were there at the time. It'll be a nice trip down memory lane, but it won't necessarily be revealing in that sense. But for a lot of younger fans, I think this history's been lost. The WWE machine has kind of successfully rewrote what wrestling history is, and wrestling history can kind of begin for a lot of fans with WrestleMania in 1985, and I think it's good to therefore try to preserve what was in this country, and I think the Wrestling Heritage website is playing a key role in doing that and having that archive there. And it would be great to hear any perspectives from any Heritage members or old wrestling fans who are listening. If anyone's listening along, let us know in the comments below, some memories, favourite moments, and their thoughts on what we discuss here today. And as well as this, it will be great to hear what young people such as myself, their thoughts on the golden era of wrestling, what they know and what they didn't know. I've certainly learned a lot over the last year or so, and I know many who were in the same boat as me, very knowledgeable about, WWE, AEW, even like WCW, like American Pro Wrestling, WrestleMania onwards, and even with a knowledge maybe of the contemporary indie scene here in the UK, but not quite grasping the scale and significance of our wrestling past and just how proud we should be of that legacy as wrestling fans here in Britain. And as well as discussing, the extent of the popularity of this golden era, we also had a look at some of the reasons for the decline and why professional wrestling was taken off television in the late 1980s and the reasons for that declining product. But yeah, without further ado, I'm going to get the episode going. Hack and Anglo-Italian, Wrestling Heritage, Headlock History Podcast. If we want to get started, do you want to each introduce yourselves and what brings you here today?
Okay, right. Well, I'm Hack. I'm a wrestling fan of the 1960s, 1970s from Lancashire. I started attending live shows in 1965, developed a greater interest. I began writing articles for magazines, Ring Sport and The Wrestler, and the programs for the Northern Joint Promotion shows. And that continued into the early 1970s when I began to lose interest in wrestling for, a number of reasons. And at that time, it became just the memories until the early 2000s when I bought my first computer and found that there were a lot of people actually at that time discussing wrestling from the old days, from the period I watched it. And one of those was Anglo-Italian, and that's how we became friends through the internet and got to know each other.
Well, that leads very nicely on to, do you want to introduce yourself as well, Anglo-Italian?
Right, so I cover the other half of the country. I was a wrestling nut for about 15 years, from the mid-60s through to late 70s. And I used to go initially to the Granada in Tooting in South London, and then change venues to the South Coast, predominantly Hastings, but other places, and then was able to go further afield to major venues like Fairfield Halls in Croydon, Royal Albert Hall, and even on occasion up north to Manchester and Bellevue. I was captivated by the colour of it all, by the excitement of it all. I was absolutely, I won't say that, but a victim of the wonderful marketing that they applied at the time. And it was on television. And it was one of the few things on television that you could then regularly go a few days later and see the same protagonists at your local hall. And there were people like me all over the country enjoying that. My own personal thing was, I've realised now, I thought I was normal at the time, but I wasn't, obviously. I was an absolute fanatic for autograph collection, and I've got a huge selection of autographs. And then the rest mirrors Hack's comments. In 2004, with my wife ill in hospital and the new internet at home, I thought, who was that wrestler, the Outlaw? And I Googled. And from that question, who was the master wrestler, the Outlaw out came all these other people, like-minded souls, enjoying the history of all those years before. And it's a remarkable fact that we're now celebrating over 20 years of discussing our heritage years online, which is longer than the time I, for one, was actually an active fan. But it's all great fun.
Yeah, I mean, you just mentioned there how it was in the early 2000s when you both found yourself on the internet. What was the step from discussing wrestling and wrestling heritage with other people on the internet to making your own forums? What was the step towards?
It was so ephemeral. We made, in our naivety, we made great long discussion documents, uploaded scans of all our collections onto a website, onto a forum, which was run by other people who we found out were in conflict with themselves. And our work, well thought out, we're both academics, was lost. And it became very frustrating. It only took us about 18 months to say, hang on, we've got to find a permanent home for this. And mindful of the importance of the word permanent, but trusting each other, because we've become great friends outside this on other issues, other matters as well. We said, we've got to make a permanent home for this.
Yeah, Anglo's quite right in what he says. And there was also the fact that not only did the work disappear, as it were, it had got a short shelf life after we put all the effort into it. It was also the fact that somebody else was actually controlling it, and it was when they announced that they were going to make big improvements. And I think as soon as anybody on the internet says that they're going to make big improvements, you know that you're going to be in trouble. And sure enough, they made their big improvements, and they disappeared shortly afterwards. We've certainly outlived them, because we're coming up to we'll soon be hitting our 20th year. So we have outlasted everyone, which in a way is sad, I think, because it was good that there were other sites out there that brought people's interest in, but they've all fallen by the wayside, and us old fellas struggle on.
Having said that, what we did have great success there. We made all sorts of forum subjects, but some of the most famous ones that we made together were tracing Kendo Nagasaki, his career. Now, if you go back 20 years, we didn't know what we know today about him. It was all that much fresher. Everybody was the new age of the internet. There were lots of people like me wondering who the Outlaw was, wondering who Kendo Nagasaki was. And then we did tracing Count Bartelli and tracing Alan Garfield. But these were great long form threads involving lots and lots of people, involving members of the family of some of the protagonists. And we were very proud of that work. And but we've managed to retrieve that, and that can still be found on Wrestling Heritage today. And work we did there on those subjects and on many other subjects as well, but especially on those three flagship researchers, they formed the history, they made history where it was absent before.
Certainly those early forum topics, we were all learning together. I mean, there were a lot of other like-minded people and very knowledgeable people, and many of them are still with us on our own website on Wrestling Heritage and contribute regularly. But we were moving together very slowly and piecing together this jigsaw, because of course there is no official history of wrestling. It was all shrouded in mystery and secrecy. And so as we all moved on very slowly, we've been piecing together this jigsaw, and it is like a jigsaw. And sometimes you think you've got all the pieces in the right place, and then you find another piece under the table, and you get that out, and that goes into place because you've just found something else out, and you start to question it moves out of place some of the previous perceived wisdom. But Anglo-Italian there mentioned those three classic forum threads, but particularly tracing Alan Garfield. Alan Garfield was a wrestler who at that time had become just about forgotten, and there was no one talking about him at the time. And Anglo started this thread about Alan Garfield, and it soon became clear that he was actually one of the most influential people that wrestling had seen. And he was an early trailblazer who went along to America and had been quite a big success there. And he'd gone completely off the radar.
And that's why the memories are so important. I remember at the time, 2004, going on the Kendo Nagasaki website, which you had at the time, and you were invited to say who your favorite wrestler was. And of course, all the sycophants had all put Kendo Nagasaki, Kendo Nagasaki. And I put Alan Garfield, my favorite wrestler of all time. And Kendo Nagasaki's in there, enjoy it #2. This was, of course, profanity on his own website. And it came from there. Alan Garfield, I saw him when he was probably past his sell-by date, but he was brilliant back in the day. So
No, yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think it's good, even though you're saying it's sad that a lot of the kind of other websites have gone, and I'm sure from your point of view it is, but it's also good to have that kind of key space, I think, for conversations like this, and wrestling heritage kind of serves that purpose on the internet. The internet is, even though everyone's on it, it's almost a smaller place nowadays in the sense that there are a lot less. It's all kind of on big social media websites now. So to have your dedicated space for that specific era of wrestling, forums still alive and active and well, and all those articles that are there, which have been very useful to me.
it would be interesting to hear a professional historian talk about our work, because we face certain obstacles that others don't have. We've got the wrestlers, Hack alluded to it, who are shrouded in mystique. They're tight-lipped, literally tight-lipped. We've had the privilege of chatting to, interviewing many of the people whose names feature on the posters over our shoulders. And that's been great. We've been invited into their homes, but in varying degrees, they won't tell you what was going on. And they still won't tell you what's going on. And therefore, we ask all our questions, we gather all our data, but at the end of the day, we make our own decisions.
And I think it's important to explain as well, just for people listening, one of the main reasons the wrestlers remain that way is because obviously wrestling was presented as a legitimate, the predetermined nature of wrestling was not disclosed by the wrestlers whatsoever at the time. Particularly a lot of older school wrestlers from that era would have been, to break kayfabe in that way would have been tantamount to a betrayal, I guess, of the business. So I think is that the reason why a lot of them are tight-lipped? They don't want to, expose the magic, expose the business. Is that
yes? I think it does go back to that, Thomas. That it's so ingrained in them that it was all shrouded in secrecy, that even now, and when they're being open, they're still hesitant. On the Grappling is Golden program, when one of the wrestlers was asked why can't you tell us now, and he sort of just shrugged his shoulders and said, well, he didn't really know why, because that's the way it had always been. And even when we're in a group and they're talking amongst themselves, even though they all know all the secrets, there's still this mystique that they keep surrounding it. And no, I think it's just been built into them, ingrained for so long that it's very difficult to get out of it, even when they want to.
Actually, it's very important because it comes to what you were talking about, the predetermined nature of the matches. The whole thing existed on a fine thread of credibility. It was magic. I always say it's like a magic show. The way it managed to work, it was on television once, usually twice a week. There were no action replays. For a lot of it was in black and white. People who were out working, they couldn't see it. People who were involved in other sports, they couldn't see it. They came home and they found people talking about the wrestling today. Oh, how am I going to see it? I've got to go down the local hall. There were no recordings. Blink and you miss it. There were no repeat shows of any professional wrestling. This was done magnificently. You'd have a slow-paced bout for 25 minutes when suddenly this madcap finish. Did the referee count to 3 too fast? No, because there was no recording of it. And this was all kept together very good. The youngsters coming into the business, they had to sell, had to put over the aging, middle-aged bill toppers of the time, like Mick McManus and Jackie Pallo and Les Kellett and Massambula, Steve Logan, and that was their job to put them over, and that gave them jobs. And if you didn't comply to all of those rules and bow down, especially to Mick McManus, but also to others, you were then banished to the independents.
Yeah,
I don't like the use of that word banished to the independents.
I think you would.
No, because that is a suggestion that the independents were in some way inferior to joint promotions. The truth is that joint promotions as a company were the people that really did establish the credibility and seriousness of professional wrestling. They did an absolutely superb job. Whereas amongst the independents, there was much more variability. Some independent promoters were extremely good and professional. There were others that were far from that. And
yeah, but let's be clear. Let's state the obvious. Joint promotions is synonymous with television wrestling, and so the independents, which we could call them, are also the non-televised wrestling. So that's different. And the independents, absolutely fantastic, absolutely essential. In the one hand, a training ground. Joint promotions cherry pick the best from there. On the other hand, good independent wrestling ensured that joint promotions were kept on their toes. We had plenty of towns. Well, Hack will tell you about Preston, where he had the abundance of choice where to attend. Southend-on-Sea in Essex was famous for really vicious business confrontations between joint promotions and independent promoters. So yeah, absolutely necessary. Great. The thing worked together, intermeshed well, worked together. And what was so strong about the business of professional wrestling, we see wrestlers, even promoters, move from the independents to joint promotions and be warmly brought in. All is forgiven. There was only the business that mattered.
Yeah, I just kind of want to bring in a discussion point, which I think is really important to establish. So kind of want to discuss the cultural grip that wrestling had kind of in that time slot over the country and how it was viewed, and to try to put across just kind of how popular it was. Because I think particularly amongst younger people, there's a view of professional wrestling in the last maybe 20 years or so that's a niche product. And I think when we talk about old wrestling, it can maybe be viewed in that lens, which isn't true. So I think that is important to maybe put across kind of what was the view of wrestling amongst normal people in the mainstream who aren't necessarily dedicated wrestling fans. Like, what was there you know, a degree of a mainstream side of that? And do you want to maybe discuss that a little bit about, you know,
it was huge. It certainly wasn't niche at all. It was a completely part of mainstream life, and wrestlers had turned up all over the place. The Beatles were photographed with Mick McManus. We had wrestlers appearing on chat shows, such there was a very popular one, the Eamon Andrews show, where he interviewed various people. McManus and Pallo were on there. They crop up in game shows on television. An entire episode of Coronation Street was devoted to a wrestling match between one of the characters of the day, Stan Ogden the Terrible, wrestling the Ian Campbell, who was one of the top heavyweights at the time. They cropped up all over the place. Newspapers. The Mick McManus had a weekly column in one of the newspapers. So no, it was absolutely huge. Just going back to my initial introduction into wrestling, I was be about 7, 8 years old, no more than 8, and I was playing in the back garden with a friend in his neighbour's garden, and his mother called us into their house, because there was this man on the wrestling, and he was wearing a ponytail. It was a ponytail and striped trunks, and that was Jackie Pallo. She didn't call us into the house to have a look at anything else. That's the only time I can remember her calling us in, and it was because this man with the ponytail was on television and she was watching it. I certainly don't recall it being a young people, a niche for young people. It was all ages, and it covered all classes as well. There was people, rich people like Anglo Italian would go along to the Royal Albert Hall, and poor people like me would go along to Preston Public Hall. Go on, Anglo. What have you got to add?
Yeah, I just remember throughout the mid-60s, adults all talking about McManus and Pallo. Will they ever wrestle again? Will they ever wrestle again after that match on TV, the 1963? That was all people ever discussed.
So if we're talking about then its popularity there, and we're kind of discussing how it came to be that slot and kind of the pull it had and the wrestlers coming in and the interest there. What do you think fundamentally is the appeal then of professional wrestling? That moral tale that kind of, I mean, it's massive now. Still, it was even bigger, like you say, at the time. Particularly in Britain. There's this long history spanning the entire 20th century into now of professional wrestling being a huge draw, a huge live draw, huge television draw, huge pay-per-view draw. What do you think fundamentally, maybe for you, but also more generally, is the appeals, and also specifically as well for that brand of wrestling that we're talking about? That is it the moral tale, or is it the sports-based presentation that it had, or what do you think it was that led it to that degree of popularity?
There was a moment's of escapism for people, I think, was going to the wrestling. You asked what was popular about it, and in those days, it was very clearly defined who the goodies were and who the baddies were. So we all knew who to cheer for.
Go back to something you said at the start of the interview, where you talked whether it's possible to have a revival of British professional wrestling. I think the word's not applicable. Revival, you can't revive it. It's something that was there and it's gone. Maybe there's been an evolution. I think the only thing that really links what we get so excited about from our memories and today is the word wrestling. In our time, there was no judo, karate, no other martial arts, was no cage fighting. Boxing was very popular with people after the war. The American heavyweights were all the heavyweight champions of the world. In boxing, we'd all seen films with actors like Kirk Douglas, where the boxers took a dive for money. So if wrestling then appeared, and it was equally underhand in various ways, well, people accepted that because boxing was like that. And the powers that be and the promoters in the wrestling were very careful, very jealously protected their product in the pre-internet times to make sure that it carefully mirrored boxing with dinner-jacketed masters of ceremonies, smoky halls.
What I'm getting from that is that as well, a big part of it that can't necessarily be recreated is the collective experience. I mean, we all nowadays, we're all in our own like algorithms, bubbles. There's not really the same level of and this obviously massively transcends wrestling. This is a kind of a more broader comment on society, I guess. But we're all kind of caught in our own worlds. There's less, even just the act of everyone sitting around the TV at the same time on a Saturday doesn't really happen anymore, except for the football maybe, and even then not quite in the same way. So do you think maybe that's a part of it as well? The kind of the collective experience of going together, everyone talking about there was only like
that's the same for TV channels. Another difference I'd say between our wrestling and what I know of modern wrestling, which isn't a great deal, they make no pretense that it's real today. The moves are completely telegraphed. The opponents are clearly willing. Now, the same was going on in our wrestling, but it was far more concealed. The art of selling a move was far more subtle. And even when you knew, like we knew, we were avid fans, we weren't stupid. We knew what was going on. But it didn't really matter. You were still absolutely hooked to go and see it, to see how they did it. This it was very dangerous, the moves they were making. It was spontaneous. They had to trust the opponent. Absolutely fascinating spectacle every time. When that actual performance in the ring was watered down and diluted to become just people deliberately, jumping on their heads. Well, that'll appeal to some people. It'll appeal to people today. Clearly, it does, from what you're saying. We had what appeared to be very competitive wrestling.
Could you guys enlighten me a little bit about the formation of the Mount Evans rules and the development from what you had pre-World War II into what it became when it was by the time it was on television in the 50s? What was the process from getting from All-In Wrestling to what we've kind of been talking about up till now? Because wrestling was presented quite different in the 1930s, wasn't it? There was a less controlled. The joint promotions didn't have that. You mentioned that stranglehold. That wasn't the case, was it, in the pre-World War II? So do you want to talk a little bit about that and how that developed?
No, in the 1930s, you're quite right. There wasn't this any big group having a stranglehold. There were certain promoters that were very important at that time. People like George Wisco was very important and busy in the 1930s, and he was a very good promoter, it seems, and put on some excellent shows. And there were good promoters and very good wrestling in the 1930s, but it became immensely popular in a very short time. And basically that created a problem in that they didn't have enough workers, enough skilled workers to actually meet the demand. So during the 1930s, standards began to fall, unscrupulous promoters came in to try and make a quick bit of money, and the wrestling fell into disrepute to some extent. And the reason I say to some extent was that some local councils then began to ban local wrestling in their halls, and that extended to London in 1944. So with the outbreak of peace in 1945, the wrestling was at quite a low ebb. It had never gone away, particularly in the north. There was still weekly wrestling at big halls such as Bellevue in Manchester and New St James Hall in Newcastle and Liverpool Stadium, all the way through the war. So it had never gone away. But the problem that they got in 1946 was that the promoters needed to do something to show that business had changed, that things were going to be different, because the reputation of wrestling was at quite a low ebb. And that's the reason that Lord Mount Evans rules were brought in. Just how much difference there was between the Mount Evans rules and what had gone before is actually open to debate. But it was the image, it was the marketing of the Mount Evans rules that came in, and of course they brought the Lord Mount Evans in, and this was sort of the equivalent to Lonsdale and boxing, and they made a big thing even at the time that we were Anglo and I were going along to the wrestling. Certainly in the north, the programs proclaimed every week that the rules had been drawn up in the House of Commons in 1946. So the Mount Evans rules did have a big difference, but did make a big difference. They had an impact, but it was more to do with the marketing. And of course, it was very important to the promoters, the post-war promoters, as part of their argument that things were now better. They did a good job at rubbishing what had gone before. basically. So, yes, there was a lot of fault in the 1930s. There were unscrupulous promoters around, but it wasn't always, I don't believe it was always as bad as was actually made out.
Using this Admiral Lord Mountevans name, and I think the key words are unifying the rules, having universal set of rules throughout the country. And you presented to all these various town halls, you presented a formula that was acceptable to them. And as you go through the mid-1950s, this idea that it was banned in such and such a place just evaporated. That was the power of the Lord Mountevans rules. They became acceptable. And of course, that was great for business. But to answer that, maybe you'll do that in a minute. Depends on the strength of joint promotions itself. So how do you build up that joint promotions? But maybe you'll ask us about that.
Well, I mean, that would lead us very nicely on then, because you come out of the post-war period, you have the establishment of those unified universal rules across the country. Joint promotions, Dale Martin, that's all set up around the same time, and it's the post-war period. Would you like to talk a little bit about that and how we end up in a situation where you have a absolutely dominant company promotion, kind of not just with those rules overseeing wrestling, but that one promotion, that one brand having such power, I guess, over the wrestling scene and kind of really being what we remember it as. I mean, I think when we talk about wrestling in that period, essentially you are talking about joint promotions. They're one and the same, really.
No, I disagree.
Okay.
I
Okay.
disagree with
Go
this
ahead.
premise that
Yeah,
when you're
absolutely.
talking about wrestling of that period, you're talking about joint promotions. Joint promotions were huge. They were the public face of wrestling for most people, simply because they owned the television contract. And with the television contract, that was a big drawing power for people, for them to get wrestlers to want to go and work for them. So I'm in no way belittling joint promotions at all, but we cannot dismiss independent promoters. There is an argument, no one would ever satisfy that argument, but there are actually more independent shows in any one night than there were joint promotion shows. There is, particularly in like South Lancashire around Manchester, it was quite feasible for a wrestler, an independent wrestler, to work 2 or 3 times in one night. Three times a night wasn't impossible for one to work in one club and then move on to another and then a third one. So yeah, the joint promotions were huge. They established the credibility of wrestling, but you certainly can't dismiss the independence. And most wrestlers that work for joint promotions also worked for the independents at one end of the career, either at the beginning or towards the end. And some wrestlers stayed with the independents for their entire career and were very, very good wrestlers. Yeah.
I see it slightly differently from you, Hack. I think we need to see the chronology of things here. You talked about the television wrestling and the independents. I think you're referring to much later times. What we're looking at here is the establishment of joint promotions, 1952-ish. Right? It was set up by a group of independent promoters, about 7 of them. And these were run in various areas of the country, run by recently retired, very skillful wrestlers, Norman Morell, the Wisco family, Jack Dale with Mick McManus in there, Billy Riley, big names. These guys, they probably shared the dressing rooms together as wrestlers. We know that from all the bills we collect from the time. And for reasons we're still not exactly sure, they managed to come together and form a cartel, which basically resulted in a monopoly around. They covered the whole country and they cut it up according to their needs. Their instruments for this domination were the Lord Mountevans rules, which let's take an example of this domination. Up to 1952, the promoter at the Royal Albert Hall was Sir Athol Oakley. By the end of 1953, he's been edged out by, with their Lord Mount Evans rules, joint promotions. You go 2 years later, not only are the town halls satisfied with this formula, you've now got the television company, the new ATV. They're happy with the rules, and professional wrestling becomes a mainstay of the new commercial channel. On the back of this nationwide uniform exposure and then small screen monochrome exposure, as Kent Walton would say, then from that you give life to the independent bills, to far more independent bills, and the independents had thriving populations of wrestlers throughout the country, and it all worked. It was more than enough work for everybody. I think that's basically what we're saying. But that would be after televisions appeared and we get to the peak year, 1962, 63. Then there's more than enough work for everybody.
I do agree with that, Anglo, there, and his assessment of the situation. Just going back to again to what you were saying, Thomas, about the dominance of joint promotions. There has always been, though, a strong challenge to joint promotions. So in the early 60s, you had Paul Lincoln Management, and they were challengers particularly to Dale Martin in the South. Later on, you had people like Jackie Pallo, who set himself up as an independent promoter. There was both him and Paul Lincoln came very close to getting the television contract. And then in the end, Brian Dixon and All Star promoters, they did actually break the monopoly. So although joint promotions were dominant in that sense, they always had to fight off challengers who wanted a piece of that cake.
Yeah, they were a challenge, but they weren't a threat because there was so much business for everybody. And just from a promotions point of view, it was a great training ground. From the independence point of view, some of the wrestlers there aspired to work for joint promotions and be on TV.
But no, that's interesting. You make the point about kind of how Hack, you make the point about like we can't necessarily think about it just in terms of joint promotions. You've got to think about the challenger brands, those independent companies. Did the independents and the television product, did they have a different feel, or was it very much all in that? I know it was obviously using the Mount Evans style, but was it a similar feel in terms of watching the product, or there must have been, some kind of difference between the two? We've discussed that a little bit.
My own experience was that the independent shows tended to be more exciting than the joint promotion shows. There was the characters were far more colourful. I was talking to Anglo-Italian the other day about the first time we went along to the wrestling to a live show, and I was a 10-year-old boy, and I got a choice because in Preston, where I went to the wrestling, there were two promoters, one independent promoter and one joint promotions, and there was a choice of two. One of them had a poster with the Wild Man of Borneo, who's had his hair, long hair, straggly hair, covering his face, and Lord Bertie Topham, who in days when being a millionaire meant something, we were told he was a real live millionaire. Even as a 10-year-old, I found that I was a bit skeptical of that. So I got the Wild Man of Borneo and Lord Bertie Topham on one side, and on the other side I got Billy Robinson, British and European heavyweight champion, one of the greatest wrestlers that Britain has ever produced, on a nice black and white poster produced by Joint Promotions with no photographs or anything. If you were a 10-year-old boy, which of those shows would you have gone along to? Of course, I went to see the Wild Man of Borneo and Lord Bertie Topham. and that's where my interest in independent shows started. So, no, the independent shows, to the most part, I would say were more colourful and more exciting. But independents were variable, and joint promotions put on excellent shows. Yeah.
And if I can speak now for Del Martin, they would accuse those exciting shows that you described probably of being abusive, because a Dale Martin bill would have technical bouts like Boschik against Steve Gray. They'd go on for 25 minutes at the start, and these two lightweights, they'd roll around the ring without ever repeating a move. Fabulous technical wrestling. Each of the builds around has that sort of bout on. Now, and if you went to a Dale Martin promotion, you knew you were going to sit through one, maybe two, so at times three such technical handshakes all round bouts, so that when Mick McManus came in, they had set the marker at a television bout. There was always a clean bout, always at least one clean bout where they rolled around the ring and they were absolutely and wonderfully skillful. But too much of that for the as Hat often tells me, you couldn't stomach too much of that in some places, and they went over the top and gave you all this things that you couldn't have on TV. You couldn't have blood on TV, hardly ever. You couldn't have foreign objects like bells and chairs on TV. It just had to be presented as a straight sport, a bit like boxing, with occasional terrible rule breaking and occasional comics like Les Kellett and Masambula.
I think if I'd known Anglo-Italian at the time and he'd taken me along to a Dale Martin show, I would probably have asked him to wake me up when it was all over.
Fair enough. Fair enough. It's kind of one last big section I want to get to before we finish up, which is about kind of the decline and I guess the eventual taking off television, and as to maybe why that happened, and maybe it bringing in some of your own interests as well. You both separately mentioned that you stopped watching respectively in the early and late 1970s. So it'll be interesting to see as well what led to, I mean, I suppose life happens as well, and that's surely a part of it. But what led to that loss of interest. So a decline in quality of the show and of the quality of wrestling that was on place. Channel changes that ITV wanted to make. They wanted a different kind of channel and a more trying to shift towards drama, and perhaps a snobbery on the part of television executives towards professional wrestling. The joint promotions presentation being outdated is another thing I've heard, and that kind of just outliving its a failure to adapt, or on the other hand, kind of a failure to realize that style was coming out of fashion, or the rise of the WWF and kind of general globalization, economic globalization. So there are a few different theories I've heard. I was wondering if I get any of your guys' takes as to why you believe that was happening, and maybe why as well, you personally stopped watching wrestling at the time you did. Was that just an age thing, or was it because you perceived the wrestling to have declined in quality to the point where you no longer wanted to watch it?
Well, I think you've answered the question. All of the above. Really, I think, Thomas. I think wrestling had reached a peak in terms of attendance, probably around 1962-63, quite early on. But it had still remained pretty healthy throughout the 1960s. But then in the early 1970s, all the old-time promoters retired, and the businesses were bought out by people that basically didn't have a wrestling background. Now, they did have the sense to put somebody in charge of the business who did have a good wrestling background, and that was a fellow called Max Crabtree. And for a short time, he did start to turn things round, and there was a slight increase in the number of fans turning up at shows. But with the declining number of shows, I suppose there became a smaller pool of wrestlers to choose from that were actually working. And Crabtree didn't always choose the best ones to make use of. He made a lot of people would say he made some poor decisions regarding his matchmaking for various reasons. And then so there became some disenchantment amongst fans and amongst wrestlers themselves, who felt that there was too much emphasis on certain characters and not necessarily the right characters. Add to that, we have heard that there was a reluctance to put his hands in his pocket deep enough on behalf of Max Crabtree, and he just didn't pay enough. Whereas somebody like Brian Dixon, the independent, then came along and he was happy to pay them a bit more, and disenchanted wrestlers, many of them began to jump ship and went to work for the independents. And this just added to the downward spiral of wrestling. And then the reason it got taken off TV, partly that, the change of product that didn't seem to have the same quality. Crabtree didn't have the same respect for fans. Fans of Anglo-Italian spoke earlier about the respect we had for wrestling, but it was a two-way process. We were treated as genuine fans, and promoters didn't make fools of us. Whereas when Crabtree came along, we felt that we were being taken for a ride at times, and that added to people turning away. So I think there was a downward spiral that added to television, and then all the your suggestions about changes in ITV management. I think that's probably true as well. What do you think, Anglo?
Yeah, it's the $1 million question, isn't it? Some other thoughts. I don't think you blame the television people at all. At all, they're there to do their job with their values. If the product was good enough, they would have been fighting to keep it. So I think we have to look internally and not squeal externally why it was taken off TV. How did the product decline? Well, as we both mentioned, by 1962, 63, there were all sorts of figures. There were 22 joint promotion shows a night around the country. So each with who knows how many, 500, 2,000, 3,000 attendees each night. Add to that, Hack will tell us how many, you want to double that, triple that for independent shows as well. Do your maths. You've got large numbers of people seeing the wrestling. They got to their peak in 1962, 63. The Duke of Edinburgh was suitably interested to attend twice in the ensuing years at the Royal Albert Hall. They got to their peak and they maintained the peak for the following 10 years. It was wonderful. They feuds like the McManus and Pallow feud, they managed to dangle that along, not with any great strategy, but within a way that actually worked in the end, before reviving it in 1973. We talked about the discipline amongst the wrestlers and the omerta that they had and still have, but also there was a discipline. It kept them clean. It kept them honest amongst themselves. They had this set of rules they had to abide by, both the wrestling rules and the way they conducted their business. And these joint promotions, promoters that we talked about, who finally joined together officially in 1952, approximately. A lot of these have had backgrounds in the Army and the Air Force, and they brought this military discipline to the business. And that's what instilled the omerta in the staff, the wrestlers, and they worked along those rigid military lines. Now, as Hack mentioned, once we get to the early 70s, we find that these guys had got older. There'd already been a sellout in partial to something called the Hearst Park Syndicate in the mid-1950s. And by the early 1970s, the big names in joint promotions, the promoters, started to disappear. And as Hack said, a name came along, Max Crabtree. I think just do the maths here. In joint promotions, we've got about 7 companies with about 10 or 12 big name promoters. And Hack has decided to replace them with one person. So you've already gone from democracy to dictatorship, and the dictatorship with nepotism, which brings in Big Daddy. It was a fair appeal, but it started to abuse the respect that we had some of the Big Daddy shows, and then Haystacks as well, and the other wrestlers who appeared in very small supporting bouts on the bill in favour of a Big Daddy show were required to do all the technical wrestling to justify that appearance. For a while it worked, but there was no long-term plan. What was clear, that those aging bill-toppers, what Del Martin were doing before they all went off to retire, they were bringing along replacements. So at the same venue, we then have Adrian Street and gold belt Maxine in the main event, middle welterweights. Look who's down the bill. The British heavyweight champion, Rocky Wall, in the support bout against these two. So we can see Del Martin Promotions doing everything they could to have replacements for these Massambula, Les Kennett, Steve Logan, McManus and Pallow. That plan, when Max Crabtree came in, I'm afraid that was abandoned. Les Kennett couldn't handle it, went to work for the opposition. Massambula spectacularly left the business in 1975 with an injury. How valid is up for discussion, on a television bout against Judo Pete Roberts. Adrian Street was sick of it all, worked for the Independents, went off to America. Jackie Pallow, sick of it all, did his own promoting. And we could go on and on and on, and people like Logan just got too old and eventually past their sell-by date, just disappeared. So there was no breeding ground, there was no nurturing going on. It just wasn't happening. And you got the impression of a promotion in the by the mid-1970s, you got the impression of a promotion where they just wanted to get all their money quick from us without any long-term interest for the business. It was all these things that came together that just weren't right. And as you alluded to, life took over. All sorts of other aspects of life took over. The opposite sex took over, and vied for our own leisure time and leisure pound as we started to work. And I don't think the American wrestling was a problem with it. You mentioned that, whether that was a cause. The American wrestling, not really a cause. If the British product had been good enough and forward-thinking enough, it would have survived.
No, it's definitely an interesting point. So I think, like you say, it is the $1,000,000 question. Really, it's there's a lot of different theories, and you hear a lot of people blaming, at the ITV point of view, but no, like you say, looking internally probably is where more so the answer is.
We also just should have mentioned a very obvious point as well: technology. As we mentioned before, in the 1960s, you get your dose of wrestling on the TV, or your 2 doses of wrestling on the TV. It was blink and you miss it. There were no action replays, and there were no repeat showings of these shows. You just had to see it and hope. By 1981, I had my first video recorder. And when the referee did count, that what seemed a little bit fast for that, or when somebody did jump through the ropes rather than actually be thrown through the ropes, and you could see it again and see it again. I mean, this was another nail in the coffin. The product we had in the 1960s, early 70s, wasn't really suited to great detailed forensic analysis.
But it was more than that also with the video recorder, because previously, 20 years earlier, 10 years, a few years earlier, as we mentioned before, if someone had seen wrestling on the television, they talked about it. The only way to get to see that would be to go down to your local hall. Now you could come home from work and you'd already recorded the match. You didn't need to go down your hall. Now you didn't need to miss a match. It was there on your telly to watch whenever you wanted it. So that was another reason that there was just no need to go to the live shows.
And there was another clever element in the promotion, that on television you would see Mick McManus against some clean undercarder one week and he'd win. Against a clean undercarder, and he'd win. Against the clean undercarder, and he'd win. And you just saw the big names against lower names. Then you'd see at your local hall that you could actually see these great names against each other.
Just kind of as we come on to like a closing segment, I wonder if you guys had any favorite, just as a fun little closer up, any favorite matches or rivalries, and maybe beyond the kind of the in particular your guy, you're in quite a unique position in terms of the breadth of knowledge that you've got. I wonder if you had any recommendations, or even any recommendations for something to read on your website or anything like that. Anything in particular that you want to promote or plug, I guess.
Well, the website now has got over 2,000 web pages on the website, hundreds of articles, and it covers just about every aspect. So just get in there and have a good rummage around, have a look, join the forum, sign up to our newsletter, which comes out once a week, and become part of our heritage community. Yeah, so do that. As for favorite matches, that's impossible because they were all so different. I suppose the thing was that it was wrestling was a very emotional event. It was all very emotive and becoming involved. So if you were to talk about a great match, you'd have to start saying, well, what do you mean by a great match? Or what is a good wrestler and what's a good match? You just become bogged down. So when it comes to emotion, 1966 or so, Wild Angus Campbell against Dirty Dominic Pye. There's a match for me to remember, and it would probably not mean a great deal to most other people, but that was total involvement in that match. So I'll go with that one.
Well, I was writing, actually, I was sharing with our members the other day my memories of seeing Kendo Nagasaki well before he'd ever been on TV back in the 1960s at the Granada in Tooting. And seeing him disrobing, I mean, we didn't know what kendo was at the time. Seeing him disrobing with this skirt and this garb and the metal helmet, and then I think deemed too violent for television. I don't think it's on any. I'll be corrected by our lovely members. When you read this, you'll correct me if I'm wrong. But I don't think on any of the YouTube matches of Nagasaki we see this ritual he did before the bout. Or we see throwing swords, that's nothing. But he used to take his sword and charge towards the opposite corner, where Steve Vidor or Judo Pete Roberts would stand unflinchingly, and he'd come down with his genuine sword right up to their nostrils with it. That was spine-tingling to see that sort of Kendo Nagasaki, a great thinking wrestler, be ahead of his time, working out things to do that would be really different and make people talk about it and come back and see again. But one of the best bouts I ever saw, Johnny War Eagle and Steve Vidor. Well, what makes it a good bout? I still to this day think it was real. I think they both lost their rag, which they probably didn't, but I like to believe that. And well, they tore lumps out of each other, and yeah, that really sticks with me. And going back to my roots of being an autograph hunter, of course, you have other moments as well. I've mentioned getting Mal Kirk's autograph, getting the Wild Man of Borneo's autograph, and almost being disappointed to see what beautiful handwriting the Wild Man of Borneo had. That was quite anomalous. But you could do another 5-hour podcast for us for all our wonderful memories.
Just go back to Kendo Nagasaki for a moment, that Anglo was talking about there. The Kendo Nagasaki in the 1960s and the first couple of years of the 1970s was a totally different sort of persona from the one that came along later. It was far more sinister and almost frightening to see as he slowly entered the ring. I don't know if there are any recordings of that time of Nagasaki in the 60s, but I think for most fans of later fans, they'd be quite very surprised at the difference. And he was, I think, sinister is the right word, far more mysterious and frightening a character. And we'd just not seen, we'd seen Mastermen before, but we hadn't seen anything at all like Kendo Nagasaki. He really was, he made a huge impact at the time.
And of course, anything at the time where there was a title match, and there weren't many title matches. Well, you just didn't see the title. Now we could go in, we could do a doctorate on why there weren't title matches, because of people physically holding onto their belt they weren't going to relinquish, because of the question about double, a superior wrestler who had been asked to go down to a less skilled wrestler to retain the title, which was good for business. So title matches were very, very rare.
Another great match to look back on, to me, that will probably resonate more with listeners than my Angus Dominic Pye match, was Kendo Nagasaki against Albert Wall. Now that was quite a match, and in that match you got two big, powerful men at their height, and it was very hard not to believe that was for real. When you saw them two going at each other, you could just tell it was real. Of course, we all knew it wasn't, but it was hard. It was hard to convince yourself that it wasn't real.
Now we're gonna keep going on now. You'll have to stop us, referee. Tell break in a moment. I remember going to the Royal Albert Hall and seeing Mick McManus against Jim Breaks, two big names. McManus was already rather portly. I think he was wearing his T-shirt at the time. I'm not sure. So towards the later years of his career, but still, in this top of the bill bout at the Royal Albert Hall, you think, what's going to give here between these two? Well, they got into the ring. It was real American style. They just started brawling. The bell went for the start. The bell went for the end of the first 5 minutes. They carried on brawling. The bell went and they carried on brawling into the next. They did 15 minutes of absolute brawl, non-stop, completely different from anything I'd seen. And then there was a double disqualification. That was magnificent. And that was great thought on their part to do something completely different at the time.
Well, I mean, that's been a really, really interesting chat about. We've gone through a lot of different things then, and as I say, it's really appreciative of you guys' time. Thank you very much again.
Well, thank you very much for involving us, and every success with your studies. And we hope that we've contributed to giving you all the benefits that you wanted to achieve.
And that wraps up this episode of the Headlock History podcast featuring wrestling heritage, and that was a great journey. We've looked back on how deeply embedded wrestling was in British culture during its heyday, not just as a TV spectacle but as a shared national experience. We explored how technology, like changes in viewing habits and the rise of things like the recorder and other related things have played a huge role in the decline, and also how internal factors like the stagnating product and the shifting cultural landscape as well contributed to wrestling's fall from mainstream favour. I think one of the most interesting points as well was the challenge that independent promoters posed to the dominant joint promotions. I think that was a really interesting and fascinating area to get into, which some of the personal memories behind that as well, which kind of remind us how powerful and weird and magical wrestling was and is to so many people. Touching on why wrestling mattered, I think maybe that's the most important element. What its appeal is, why people care now, why people still care about wrestling from so long ago. And I think this conversation, if anything, this conversation shows that wrestling story in Britain is about more than just the matches themselves, even more than just the characters. It's about nostalgia and identity. I think you can really hear the passion when Hack and Anglo Italian are talking. There's a lot of nostalgia going on there. Not that I'm doubting their credentials at all. They're immensely well sourced and knowledgeable. But the passion with which they speak as well is really captivating and really pulls you in. So I'd really just like to thank them again for coming on. And I'd like to thank you all for listening as well. And yeah, in the next episode, we're going to be having a chat with Kieran McConnell. Kieran McConnell is the former owner and co-owner and promoter of Infinite Promotions, a Liverpool-based promotion. We're going to be doing a couple of things. We're going to be talking about his experiences in the wrestling business. We're going to be talking about getting his views as well. He's a bit of a history buff as well, so we're going to be getting a talk bridging the gap between the current era and this golden era that we were discussing today. We're going to be bridging that gap a little bit about what occurred in wrestling in that kind of middle period. We're also going to be looking at his own experiences in the wrestling business, and he's a wrestler as well, so we'll be getting into that, I'm sure, as well. But yeah, once again, thank you all for listening, and as always, the extended version of this podcast is available on youtube.com/BritWrestCentral. Shorter, more condensed, tighter episodes will continue to come out on the Londoners News Spotify account. So yeah, we'll see you in the next episode, coming out next Tuesday. Hope you all have a good Easter.